Welcome everyone to today's Climate Chatter, where we'll be discussing how climate protection projects can be a solution to current global climate inaction. I am Maria Carvhalo, and I work in South Pole's climate policy and carbon pricing team. So I do work a lot with the private sector to see how they can get involved with supporting climate protection projects to help meet the global net zero target. Now, before we start chatting, a few housekeeping rules. As attendees, you're all on mute at the moment, but that shouldn't stop you from typing in questions for the Q&A that will be answered at the end. So don't be shy. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. We'd also like to thank you for submitting questions ahead of this webinar, and I've tried to answer these questions during the course of our conversation. But just so you know, this webinar will be recorded and sent to you within the next week. And last but not least, we're all broadcasting from our homes. So please bear with us in case there are any technical hiccups. Now, on to the fun stuff. I am delighted to be joined today by two colleagues from South Pole, Christian Dannecker, based in our Medellin office, and Bamshad Houshyani in Amsterdam. Before speaking with them, I will first set the scene by investigating why there is global climate inaction in terms of having ambitious enough policies. Secondly, we will look at ways in which the private sector can contribute towards plugging that gap through climate protection projects so we can collectively achieve global climate targets, such as meeting net zero by 2050. I will then bring in Christian and Bamshad to talk about two actionable solutions that are increasingly being discussed to reach that target. The first, nature-based solutions, which I'll now refer to as NBS projects for short. And as many of you are in Europe, how climate protection projects can help Europe with meeting its own net zero target under the Green Deal. So let's get started. If we look at this paragraph, at this graph actually, we can see that current government pledges aren't enough to meet Paris targets. This is a real problem. If we want to avoid disastrous climate change by reducing the policy ambition gap and providing sufficient finance to meet Paris targets, we really need to figure out ways to scale action. Now, it is worth stepping back and thinking about, why do we have this policy gap? First, both businesses and governments are more likely to be reactive in addressing short-term and pressing issues than creating comprehensive plans for long-term transformational change. That is why we have something like the Paris Agreement, to push governments to continually submit and update their climate targets as a way of focusing towards the long-term emission reduction target. And 2020 is a key year under the Paris Agreement, as governments are expected to announce updated and enhanced climate targets. The problem is with COVID, it is unclear whether countries will draw back on their climate ambition. Having said that, the World Resources Institute has reported that 106 countries have pledged to increase their climate targets. Unfortunately, so far, remember it's May 2020, so we do have a few months, but so far only 8 countries have actually submitted updated NDCs, and they only represent 3% of global emissions. So, while climate inaction has existed prior to COVID, this global health issue now puts a big question mark on how governments will respond to climate action. The climate community is advocating for greening the post-COVID stimulus packages, and it'll be important to see whether governments see this as a single great opportunity to integrate the economy, public health, and the climate into a single comprehensive recovery plan. Of course, this may not happen for all countries, particularly for those economies that are heavily dependent on the sale of carbon-intensive commodities like fossil fuels, which are quite the common culprit in this discussions. But we kind of forget that land use change is also a very significant driver of emissions. So agricultural products like cattle, soy, and palm oil are also another type of economy. Those economies that are dependent on selling those products to domestic and foreign markets, they also are less likely to put in more ambitious climate change action. In this case, governments will not be interested in undertaking more ambitious climate action unless, we see their export markets actually transition away from consuming the carbon-intensive products they sell, which puts them in a very risky position, but also draws questions on a just transition. How can we get these types of economies to move away from the carbon-intensive sectors and pivot towards industries that are less carbon intensive? I mean, these are the ways in which we think about engaging and enabling a just transition, but also thinking about ways in which you could create sectors and industries in those economies. Now, this can be an expensive proposition to carbon intensive economies, particularly in developing countries, as climate technologies still are too expensive to deploy. Therefore, what are the ways in which we can enable a low carbon transition for developing countries to leapfrog over our carbon intensive development by using technologies that are currently available in developed countries? Just updating existing carbon intensive infrastructures in developing countries by what's currently available in developed countries really does lead to a massive and cost effective emission reductions, and it's faster than generally trying to get developed countries who are already efficient sometimes to reduce their own emissions. If you can just think about the time scale that we don't have that much time, and this can lead to really major reductions. It's a very interesting proposition. But simply transferring technologies is not sufficient either, because what we see is a major obstacle in many developing countries is a lack of know-how on how to implement climate policy action in different sectors. And we regularly see this at South Pole. We work with many governments on developing climate action plans, and even just something as simple as creating systems to measure and report their emissions. And one of the key challenges is that the task of coming up with climate policies and targets is given to the Ministry of Finance. However, they do not necessarily have the regulatory powers, nor the capacity or know-how to advise on how to measure and reduce emissions in carbon-intensive sectors like industry, agricultural, and transport, because that falls under the purview of other ministries. So, okay, that's a lot of challenges, and that can explain why there may be a gap in policy action. What are the solutions? And specifically, what can the private sector do to help in achieving net zero targets? Well, climate protection projects could be the answer here. These projects refer to the deployment of climate technologies or solutions that are too expensive in the country, nor is there any government support for their deployment. The financing of these projects is done through the sale of carbon credits, whose revenues are used to recover the upfront capital costs of that project, some of the operating cost, and the capacity building needed to implement these projects. Of course, strong governance of carbon credit certification really is needed to ensure that that carbon credit does represent a ton of CO2 that is either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. And therefore, it is essential that climate projects are certified by the most rigorous of standards. So when we think about it, climate protection projects can act as a frontrunner to policy action by showing what is possible, particularly where no action is being done. Specifically, they can channel finance into developing countries by transferring best-in-class technologies that are above existing regulatory standards. The implementation of these projects actually builds know-how amongst local stakeholders on how to implement climate solutions on the ground, which is really important when you want to test and adapt these solutions to the context of that country, because that's where a lot of technology transfer projects fail. And if it's successful, these projects can build local resilience. And in thinking about the success of pilot projects, it can actually help the host country determine if they want to take more domestic policies to support scaled up action. Now they know that this project can work in their country, and there is financing available in some ways. So there are different ways the private sector can engage with climate protection projects, and that can be by providing upfront investment into climate protection projects, or they can actually buy the carbon credits to support the commercial viability of these projects. And you can really think about, many companies are multinational, so you can create climate projects within your own supply chain. Now, let's visualize this a bit. What does the net zero journey of a business look like? And we have the following graph, which shows climate protection projects, and it shows the current policy trajectory of emissions. And what businesses can do is go beyond that current policy trajectory. by reducing emissions within your own operations. For example, switching to renewable energy and switching your electricity supplier to renewables. You can also support avoiding emissions, which means like avoiding, even though it's not within your supply chain, you can avoid emissions by from emissions that would have been released by cutting down trees, or supporting climate action projects that distribute water filters. And last, you can invest in projects that actually remove emissions from the atmosphere, such as reforestation or carbon capture and storage. So now that we've set the scene, without further ado, I'd actually like to talk about two ways in which these types of projects occur through avoidance and removal. Christian, you have the floor on how NBS projects can help with meeting net zero targets.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks everyone to be in this call. And happy to give you an overview quickly, first of all, what nature-based solutions would be in the area of carbon removal, carbon emission reductions and removal projects. Basically, it's anything related to nature, restoration of ecosystems, protection of them, conservation, afforestation of natural ecosystems, and also other shades of gray, agroforestry schemes, silvopastoral schemes. And by the way, also aquatic ecosystems. You can do NBS projects in mangrove conservation and mangrove afforestation. Even coral protection or coral replanting has a, albeit marginal, effect on CO2 fixation and other more exotic things such as seagrass restoration. So it's quite a wide array of opportunities that are there, and I'm happy that to see that this is getting ever more important for the market.
No, absolutely. There's so much that can be done. And we're also seeing there's such a surge of interest in nature-based solutions with companies like Co-op and even several oil and gas companies who are investing into these types of projects to support global decarbonization. Now, we also see many organizations like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development develop kind of these coalitions of supporting nature-based projects through things like the NCS Alliance. But, you know, why is this the case? Why is there such a surge in interest in nature-based solutions?
I think it's at least 6 points. Several of them I wanted to mention. One is that often the nature-based solutions are simply linked to your supply chains. And if you want to take serious your emission reductions in scope 3, you don't get around nature-based solutions. So often you have a link between cacao production, palm oil production, and so on with emissions, and you can tackle that by focusing on nature-based solution carbon reduction opportunities. The second one is the co-benefits are actually quite massive. I mean, there is no such nature-based project that cannot come in a package with poverty alleviation, biodiversity conservation, or equitable development, because those projects are often located where, you know, delivering these benefits are the enabler to actually deliver emission reductions. And also, they are often located in areas where there might not be any other climate mitigation project available, so to say. If you are in a maybe not that far developed country, you might not have that substantial power plant related emissions or transport sector emissions that you can reduce. But you can potentially reduce millions of tons of emissions from deforestation, avoid the degradation, or by degrading ecosystems. Also, another point is interesting, which is you can actually make a big difference with payments for environmental services, including carbon, because in areas, specifically those with sort of marginal agriculture productivity, you can actually get the whole project or most of the project paid for with payments for environmental services, with carbon credits. So the additionality is, you know, very big. That might be in other cases less so. You know, if you have carbon credits from a wind farm or expansion of a public transport system, then carbon credits are often still crucial to make it happen. Yet they are one of many revenue streams. And maybe two more things. One is many countries haven't been able to participate in, say, the CDM in the past or in VCS project development. But with nature-based solutions, they actually have the opportunity to do that. It's interesting how to see how our portfolio also developed from countries that we had more before and countries that we had today. And there's more and more say, exotic country locations in our projects, because they can participate in nature-based solutions. And finally, maybe a more kind of a legal thing. There are many nationally determined contributions that have been proposed by countries, as Maria mentioned, and they often are very clear and strict on the renewable energy side and on the methane avoidance side, but often they are not so much clear in the avoided emissions and land-based side, and therefore there could be projects that simply have less issues with kind of being double counted or double claimed in any way in the nature-based solution sector.
All right, so that's a lot of different benefits. But can you explain how this works on the ground, especially in terms of building relationships with local communities and supporting sustainable development as part of nature-based solutions?
Of course. Let's use an example maybe from Colombia, where I am. We work with a indigenous community in Vaupés department, which is basically part of the Amazon basin, the Colombian Amazon basin. And these communities, I mean, why do we work with them? First of all, the question is, do we work with them or do they work with us? It's their project, not ours. It's in nature-based solutions, it's often not the project of some company or some large, entity. It's often communities that own this land. And so I guess I have to say they work with us. And why do they do this? Because it has been proven that communities, and especially indigenous communities that have their land rights gazetted and respected, often take better care of their land than if that is not the case, and therefore are better in tackling deforestation, reducing deforestation rates. And in this case, they have life plans, planes de vida, which are basically their own cosmovision of how they want to see development happen in their areas. But often the life plan's there, but then they don't have finance and they don't have the technical resources to actually deliver on them, to make them happen. And that leads to the threats to the forests not being tackled. So you could see encroachment of cattle farming, you could see encroachment of mining, simply because sometimes those areas are so big that it's hard to police looking after them. And the finance that you need two things to make this life plan to be delivered on. One is finance and the other one is technical know-how. The finance from the carbon credit sales revenue could be substantial, given that these communities have substantial areas of forest. And the technical skills, those we focus on in the early stage of these projects. We make sure that the communities, indigenous leaders and experts actually drive the projects themselves. And we had them in our Medellin office, we had them in our Bogota office for training on community development engagement, participatory mapping, GIS work, and so on. And honestly, also to us to be trained by them, because there's a completely different cultural setup and way to do things. And we learned probably as much as they did. And they also exchanged insight on how other projects did this in the area. And now I think this is a very engaged community that has the technical base and has the carbon finance available to conserve this huge piece of forest in the Vaupés area. Just a quick note, maybe related to the net zero discussion for NBS projects, because there's a little bit of a, I don't know if it's an artificial line between avoided emissions and removals. My point here is it's important to focus on the landscape approach. You often have projects that need reforestation or restoration or agroforestry systems, so that people have their productivity and their income from those areas, and so that they stop driving deforestation elsewhere to make a revenue income. And then the question is, do you only account for the carbon that is absorbed by the agroforestry system? You can do that, but of course it could potentially be massively lower than if you also account for the avoided deforestation. Often the activities to avoid deforestation exactly do not happen in the forest, but around it. And only if you look at the whole ecosystem, it kind of makes integral sense.
Wow, I have more questions, but I think just in the interest of time, I may leave that towards the end. But it's really important ways in which, and a really great example of how nature-based solutions really can provide a comprehensive approach between local communities and landowners on supporting an alternative livelihood to a lot of the things that create deforestation, but also in terms of rehabilitation. So it's a really cool technology and type of project in terms of doing both avoiding emissions where it's needed, and also restoring and removing emissions through reforestation or afforestation. But let's go and bring it a little closer to home in Europe. Bamshad, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks so much, Maria and Christian, for a very interesting discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, thanks for the attendees in this climate chatter. European projects are actually these days one of the main trends within our project development. And maybe I first quickly go a little bit back into the history of why now we look into European projects, while in the past 15 years, there was a lot of discussion on developing countries' potential in emission mitigations. So if you remember, Maria, almost 15 years ago, the first waves of accreditation of actual emission reductions in Europe happened with the joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol, which by then, of course, was a mechanism for the compliance using the allowances used between countries. Later on, of course, this was accompanied by a clean development mechanism, but of course, that was for projects hosted by developing countries, non-Annex I countries, which then allowed the voluntary sector, which by then, through the increase of public awareness of the catastrophic negative impacts of climate change, started looking for ways to invest into responsible activities where they can, to some extent, compensate their footprints. Later on, of course, after the CDM, a few voluntary standards such as VCS and Gold Standard joined these efforts, which ended up us developing quite a lot of projects, from renewables to energy efficiency, industrial, community-based remote areas, serving, let's say, remote energy access projects or water purification systems, cook stoves, and so on. And of course, later on, RED Plus, in general, a FOLU sector added to this list. But now the question is, why Europe? You mentioned, Maria, technological developments in climate mitigation has different costs as well. So when we look into the mitigation costs in Europe, Europe as a relatively more efficient area in the world, is very hard sometimes to find potential of mitigation in specific sectors. And usually in specific sectors, when you go at the very end, last bits of potential to reduce your footprint, you end up with spending a lot of money for that last bit. So the mitigation costs had a lot of role here in order to decide for economies, for industrial sectors in Europe, to see where, depending on economic models, where they would be best to spend their money on climate mitigation. But now it is time, as you know, climate action is real now. We have only 3 decades left to survive this climate catastrophe. Now we see this wave of industries who are finally taking the cost of nature recovery, the cost of venting greenhouse gas into atmosphere into their business models. In the past centuries where we experienced industrialization in Europe, this is actually the first time we see this happening, which is really a great thing. It's growing. Finally, we are paying attention to also spend some money to make sure that the resources we are using are recovered, are renewed, are finally being good for future generations to remain and use as well. So in this regard, many corporates based in Europe now thinking it's the time to also invest in some projects in our own country, and not only going to find these projects elsewhere. So they are looking into projects in their own neighborhood, in their own backyard. So this is a new trend that makes us work on new European projects mitigation potentials.
Okay, so I mean, is that some of the reasons why governments like France, Netherlands, and Spain are developing domestic standards or labels to certify carbon credits? Or could this be a precursor you know, for compliance measures, or is it just going to be purely for voluntary purposes?
Yes, so Europe is a bit of a let's say challenging area for us, and maybe for many people who are working in this sector. As you know, there is a European emission trading scheme, EU ETS, that covers quite a lot of sectors, such as utilities, power plants, heavy industries, metal, and so on. So when we look into emission reduction potentials or mitigation potentials in Europe, we have to focus on sub-industries and those sectors that are not covered by the compliance schemes, which then leaves us some narrowed potential technologies in other areas which we are actually exploring these days. And that's the reason why these domestic standards, domestic voluntary standards, are there in order to distinguish those sectors and make sure project developers and responsible industries who are going to climate finance these projects are not going to, let's say, cause double counting or double claiming in such aspects. So yes, so these domestic schemes are going to help to make sure these mitigation potentials are real, are transparent, are verifiable for the offer to the voluntary sector.
Okay, well, then what kind of projects could you see coming out of the EU based on that?
Yes, that's a very good question. It is challenging again, but we are exploring with our team quite interesting sectors, such as when it comes to urban areas, we have a few urban topics such as transport, such as smart heating, such as a smart combined heat and power, district heat and power systems, which uses geothermals, for instance, as an example. When it comes to land use, we have few items we're exploring. We have agriculture sectors, animal farms. We have some peatland subjects in Europe, afforestation, and biogas. You can add to that circularity, waste handling in general. There are quite some topics that so far either was difficult for governments to design a proper MRV system to, let's say, count on their mitigation potentials and in general greenhouse gas inventories. These are the sectors that we try to absorb climate finance for the voluntary sectors, let's say. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So some of the hardest to tackle sectors in terms of putting in policies or even measuring emissions, this is where carbon projects could play a really great role in terms of, you know, capacity building and in terms of setting up MRV systems. I know this is one of the key things with carbon methodologies and carbon project development is to set that up. And then it, especially for hard to track sectors like buildings and agriculture. So yeah, that's really cool. It can actually provide the right incentives to enable mitigation action so European governments can meet their net zero targets. Because I know from it, you know, buildings, enabling energy efficiency and agriculture tend to be the difficult ones. All right.
Yes.
And then what I think in order to have enough time, I'm just gonna like bring this all back in together in thinking about how we bring together nature-based solutions. So could we go to the next slide then, please? You know, so we have enough time. I'm just going to summarize some of the key things we think about, because obviously, you know, we really want to reflect back to our audience here, and we really welcome your thoughts on the conversation. But, you know, net zero, this is the key rallying cry. And like Bamshad said, we have 30 years to hit net zero, which means we'll need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we'll also need to increase carbon sinks. And governments do have a significant role in plugging the gap to net zero, but climate protection projects can pilot and scale innovative mitigation activities that are on the ground through climate action. And, you know, it avoids and removes emissions. So while we're very much about ensuring that everyone reduces their own emissions, there still is a role to play for avoiding and removing emissions to meet the net zero target. And, you know, the private sector can contribute to enabling climate protection projects, and that can be done by investing into the development of these projects or buying credits. But when we think about that, when we think about the balance between reducing, avoiding, and removing, you know, it really is important for companies to know how to engage with climate protection projects. And when you do that, we would strongly advise companies to report separately how you have reduced your emissions, and then how you have contributed to reducing global emissions by investing into climate projects or buying their credits. And because there is greater need for transparency in terms, particularly with investors wanting to be able to see the balance of risk within your company, and then also beyond that, you know, it is important to report these two things separately, because it's transparent, and it also provides credibility to both your direct and indirect contributions to meeting global climate targets. And really, your contribution towards supporting climate projects should not be underplayed. Climate protection projects provide a business model to scale climate finance and accelerate climate action in sectors, especially for those which are particularly hard to mitigate emissions, like Bamshad and Christian have shown in terms of nature-based solutions, but also for buildings and even transport. And you know, and also beyond that is just to helping vulnerable communities who live in developing countries and would need that kind of technology transfer. And so, you know, what we'd really like to emphasize is how important it is that while reducing your own emissions is really important, but also contributions is really important to plugging the gap to net zero targets, because it allows for scaling in places where it's so hard to do that kind of action. So now that I hope I've really shown you the role that we have in climate protection projects, let's open it up for questions. And yeah, feel free to keep on putting it into the chat box. We're monitoring this as well. One of the things that has already come in is how many billions of tons of negative emissions will be required, and where will they come from? Now, yeah, that's extremely difficult to determine, because it will have to be determined on what the trajectory is going to be. What we do know is that just to meet, you know, we have to halve emissions by 2030, and according to the latest UNEP emissions gap report, about 13 to 16 gigatons will need to be, the gap is 13 to 16 gigatons to meet 2 degrees in that time by 2030, and 26 to 29 gigatons need to be reduced by 2030 to meet the 1.5 target. Now, to what extent will that actually be through removals? I'm not quite sure. It depends on which comes first, but you know, it could be through like nature-based solutions in terms of afforestation and reforestation are more on the way at the moment than CCUS. But you know, things could change. We've seen technology suddenly reduce emissions very quickly, so it'd be important to think of that. I'm going to move towards another question that seems to have come through for Bamshad. So picking up on Europe, what do you think, you know, this is an interesting question. It's just which type of climate protection projects are the priority in Europe in terms of impact, and which ones are closest to profit?
Yes, that's a good question. So obviously, as I mentioned, the industrialization in Europe also caused quite damage to biodiversity and to nature in Europe. We are working with few NGOs in a partnership in order to identify areas in Europe that we can recover in terms of biodiversity, bringing back the forest covers, or in terms of leveling the water in areas of where we have peatlands. So in general, nature-based solutions again would be our priority in Europe. But as I mentioned, there are quite some technological solutions such as smart heating systems in urban areas, transport, or any areas we see there is potential for us as is not overlapping with compliance, or in this case, some of the NDCs in this country. So I would say nature-based solutions would be our priority, as some of these domestic standards that you also mentioned are actually focusing on some of those Volu or nature-based solutions. But which one is coming to profit? I think it's actually a new sector in general. European mitigation project, as I mentioned, since JI, this topic has been paused. But I can say some afforestation and some peatland projects, including soil carbon, by the way, and some solutions for animal farms would be the next upcoming projects in Europe.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I'm going to ask this question to Christian, which is, we didn't get a chance to cover it earlier, but you know, the UN SDG report has talked about the overlap between climate and biodiversity and the importance and the reinforcing nature between those two. How can climate protection projects also finance biodiversity conservation?
I mean, they're often very close to each other, specifically if it's about an avoided emissions project or a landscape restoration project. So I can give you an example. For example, we work with ESA, which is in Latin America, a large company that operates the high tension power grids. And they wanted, together with us and with the NGO called Pantera, focusing on conservation of large cats, they wanted to pack it into one and say, look, we want to offset the remaining emissions that we cannot avoid, for example, from our transformators, but we also want to get to biodiversity conservation. And they actually connected it then to the Jaguar, because they connect people with their power lines, and they see that the Jaguar also needs long distance connectivity to thrive. And now there's this program that runs focusing on delivering carbon abatement within Jaguar corridors across 4 countries in Latin America. And we opted to use, again, carbon certification standards, in this case, VCS and CCB, simply because the carbon market is the largest global payment for environmental service scheme with all this infrastructure available, methodologies, registries, auditors, and so on. We could also have opted for separate biodiversity monitoring approaches, which we also actually do. For example, we have camera traps in a systematic way set up that trace not only the existence, but the amounts and so on of felons like jaguars and pumas. But in the end, we use the carbon kind of market framework to deliver monitoring, reporting, and verification for this. So for me, there's specifically the CCB standard with climate, community, and biodiversity standard, which, as the name says, really asks us to cover 15 elements of a sustainable development across these 3 areas and not only carbon. So that's an example. I think you cannot really do much REDD+ or much nature-based projects without having to tackle and manage biodiversity basically automatically.
Okay. That's really interesting. I mean, in a kind of related question that's coming in from our audience, you know, we know a lot of biodiversity is in blue carbon and marine ecosystem related offsets. So what are the opportunities do you see in blue carbon types of projects?
It's a new area that's coming up. I mean, in terms of, if you measure it in terms of carbon impacts that you can generate, then of course coastal ecosystems come in first. We do work with mangrove restoration in Honduras. We work with mangrove conservation in Indonesia. And there's other more, you know, maybe even more attractive from the biodiversity side opportunities, but then in terms of carbon benefits might be a little less. For example, Gold Standard is thinking about working on a methodology that would allow to quantify emission reductions from seagrass restoration or seagrass conservation. And there's opportunities out there to do this, where of course you have to focus more on sustainable fisheries, sustainable tourism to attain this. Yeah, there's a couple other opportunities, such as also in the Nordics, you can focus on kelp forest management or conservation, but they are not yet there in terms of methodologies that we would be able to use to certify carbon outcomes.
Okay. Well, in thinking about that, I imagine that would require a lot of communities' involvement. A question that we've gotten is there any projects that we have that engages the communities directly by making the actual community shareholders?
I mean, I think I'll turn that around. I think often they are by default the owners of these projects. So, in the Bamshad project, the communities own the land. It's collectively owned by them. And there's a community organization that is in charge for development projects in their area. Same for our Kariba project in Zimbabwe. The rural district councils there own the land and decide about what to do with them. And therefore, they are the owner of this project, and we are there to help. We are there to make it happen, to bring best practices into operations, to advise on what activities are the best to implement on the ground, but we cannot do anything. We don't own the project as South Pole or anything like this. Now, of course, there's other cases where this is not the case. In many countries where formally the government owns carbon and not the communities, although the communities might have rights to benefit from them. There's all kinds of shades of gray in different countries. And then of course, you can focus on actually supporting companies in those areas that can be, of course, community owned, or could be, collectively owned by farmers, for example, and support those companies to deliver to deliver sustainable commodities, or to deliver income streams that are in line with the REDD+ objectives you have. Talking about sustainable cacao production, helping them to access the market with certified honey and so on. So we actually also we're working on a fund that would be supporting such adaptation and mitigation focused companies within projects in the Global South.
Thanks, Christian. I'm going to end with this last question that someone has asked, which is brilliant, which is, we've had, several decades worth of experience in the carbon credits market. And Bamshad, what would you say are some of the best lessons, your top 3 lessons that we can learn for climate protection projects?
Yes, so I would say technology-wise, we will have to really make sure we will tap really the mitigation potentials on all angles. As we know, as I mentioned, there is economic calculation for every mitigation effort you want to put. In some areas, these costs are higher for mitigation activities than some other areas. But if we are looking for an honest climate action, I think we have to learn to be able to focus on all these sectors, which will equally also service different communities. My experience in the past, as an example, was that although several methodologies were developed under different standards for, let's say, off-grid or energy access projects, these projects, due to their high transaction costs, unfortunately, were not enough developed under the climate mitigation actions, under both compliance periods, under the clean development mechanism, but also under the voluntary. So one of the lessons in order to equally address some of these topics in very remote areas in the world where people are actually in need of quite some services that can come with climate finance. I think other lessons would be also to learn from this leapfrog process in technological advances, and to adopt our MRV systems in order to reduce transaction costs. In the past 15 years experience, which started from CDM, we have seen this trend that from manual surveys or manual measurements on indicators in different projects, we have moved to digitalization of MRV, which would allow us to focus these finances more into the actual job on the ground in order to gain further climate actions, instead of spending them on admin costs and transaction costs. Connected to that, also, I would say the other effort we can try to learn is to use more advanced techniques on absorbing climate finance. And in order to do that, I think we have to try to involve all parts of the society, and not only, I would say, not only corporates. Corporates, of course, have a huge responsibility. They have been using natural resources for producing whatever services and products that the community need, but also the community, on the other hand, expect these industries to be more respectful to nature. So I think involving civil societies, involving in general communities, as Christian also mentioned, is a key to success. So I would say we have to try to involve all part of the society and communities in order to be successful in the remaining 3 decades we have.
That's great. And I think that's just a wonderful way to wrap up our climate chatter. But before everyone goes, we'd like to introduce a poll. There's many more. We're always looking for climate topics. We're really passionate about it. And so if you could take a quick poll to figure out which types of topics you'd like to talk about more, we're more than happy to get more into depth in the future. I'll just give a minute for that. All right, great. So in the future, we'd love to keep on speaking with you. So if you have submitted questions and really would like those answers, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll be more than happy. As you can tell, we love talking about this stuff, so we're more than happy to respond to you. In the meantime, we have much more climate chatter coming up. And please do look at our website to be able to sign up. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you guys for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care and have a great day.